Welcome back, everybody. So, we're going to be covering part B of the Hellenistic age in this lecture. If you haven't listened to part A, please go back and listen to part A, as this lecture will make a lot more sense once you have. So, today's focus is going to be very similar to our last one, and it's going to be this. The lecture mentions vulnerability, inwardness, and individuality as three modes that dominated Hellenistic thought. How are these trends evident in philosophy and the arts? So we talked about religion last time in this context, but today we're going to be moving to philosophy and the arts. And just as a review, I want to just unpack those terms again. And we talk about vulnerability, we're talking about a mood that existed in the Hellenistic age that people felt less secure, more vulnerable, um, uh, less less empowered than they had in classical times. We also talked about inwardness as another aspect, and inwardness is a tendency to focus on one's personal life, the personal things that are happening to one as opposed to the community. We saw that this was manifest in two forms. One was escapism, and escapism is kind of trying to distract yourself, get away from your problems. And the other was a fascination with inner states. Um, Psychological orientation. How do people react under stress? The last of these that we talked about in the last lecture was individuality, and we think we all know what individuality is, but in this case, we're talking about people as individuals as distinct from the community, their polis. People become more interested in individual people rather than the group or the polis. So these are some of the trends that we talked about in the last lecture, and we're going to continue to unpack today. So on to philosophy. We talked about religion last time, and religion has a very broad appeal. Many different groups in society, almost everybody took part in some sort of a religious faith and tradition. But philosophy wasn't like that. Philosophy was really an elite occupation. That's because it took a lot of money to go to school, and it took a lot of time to learn these very abstract ideas. And so it really appealed to a much narrower, it's tough to get out of your mouth, uh, band of the social spectrum, namely the elites. But we see parallel developments between religion and philosophy. There is a move away from concern with the city-state. Had you gone back to classical Athens, or if you read the writings of Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, then you will find that their philosophy always takes place in the context of the city-state. Plato's most famous work was called The Republic. How do we design the ideal city-state? Aristotle's greatest work, perhaps, was The Politics, which dealt with the same themes. Naturally, people in the Hellenistic age wouldn't be so interested in those themes because they weren't free anymore, and there was really no point to thinking about such things. But what people were interested in, and something we do see a movement toward in philosophy, is toward psychological type philosophies. People become concerned with how to find peace, how to find fulfillment, how to be released from anxiety in this particular age. And so philosophy takes up these questions. Now, One of the philosophies that I want to look at is called Epicureanism. And Epicureanism is a type of hedonism. Let me write that word down, hedonism. H-E-D. Oops, H. Let's try that again. H-E-D. Hedonism. Hedonism. And hedonism is a philosophy that teaches that pleasure is the highest good. And so it's a type of escapism in a sense. Hedonists were known to engage in all sorts of intoxication and sexual pleasures as a way to escape from their problems. I think a lot of modern college boys are probably hedonists without knowing about it. Next time someone accuses you of any of these behaviors, you can just plead that you're a hedonist, and you'll be accurate. And so the hedonists taught that pleasure was the highest good. Escape from your problems through pleasure. Epicurus was a type of hedonist, but he was a sophisticated hedonist. Basically, he wanted pleasure. He believed pleasure was the highest good, but he defined pleasure as the absence of pain. So probably a little less cool hedonist. And what Epicurus promised is that if you followed his philosophy, you could achieve ataraxia. Let me write that down. It's a Greek word, A-T-A-R-A-X-I-A, ataraxia. And ataraxia was the absence of anxiety. Now, one of the great fears that people have always had is a fear of death. Epicurus said we shouldn't fear death, though, because he was a materialist. He put forward a materialist philosophy. Well, what's a materialist philosophy? Basically, Epicurus taught that the world in the universe was made up of atoms, including humans. Humans are made up of atoms. These atoms come together randomly, and then they disintegrate. And so there really wasn't anything to fear with death because there wasn't a soul. So 1 minute you would be there, and then you would die, and then it would be lights out. So there was really nothing to fear then, because you wouldn't exist anymore to fear anything. A lot of people were afraid of the gods. Now, Epicurus, at least in his writings, didn't go as far as atheism. But what he taught was he taught that if there were gods, that these gods are busy enjoying themselves, they're thinking about themselves, and they're not concerned with you. And so don't worry about the gods. Instead, Epicurus said we should detach from our desires, detach from, our desire to cling to life, but also to detach from politics. He said politics is just craziness. The pursuit of money is craziness. And step away and go to a retreat. Have a couple of close friends. Don't concern yourself with life too much. Try to enjoy yourself, and you will find peace. And so this was the nature of Epicurus's philosophy. And again, this is a type of escapism. A very different philosopher, but one whose conclusions came to kind of a similar place, was Zeno the Stoic, the founder of Stoicism. And Stoicism was another philosophy that became popular in the Hellenistic era. And Zeno promised a type of peace as well, a type of ataraxia. Unlike Epicurus, whose philosophies were pretty close to atheistic, Zeno was a monotheist. He believed that there was a God who had created the entire universe, kind of like almost like a king. And he ruled this universe through law. Zeno called this natural law, which was going to be a very powerful idea throughout Western civilization. But essentially, the way Zeno thought of natural law was that pretty much everything in life is predetermined. You don't really have too much choice in life. In other words, you may go back and beat yourself up for something that you did that hurt somebody. But Zeno would say, well, it really wasn't you because you didn't really have a choice of it. You know, if you stubbed your toe this morning, you could beat yourself up over it, but really in Zeno's philosophy, there wasn't anything you could do about it. It was already baked into the cake. Our entire lives are just already predetermined for us. So he said this is natural law. God has preordained these things in such a way. And where his philosophy comes in is that there really wasn't much that you could do about things. There was only one thing that you could really control, and that was your disposition toward things. That is, that was your interpretation of things. I should mention that Stoicism has had a comeback in recent years, so you can go on YouTube and there's all sorts of modern Stoics out there. So we can only control our reaction to things. Now, what Zeno taught was that foolish people look at the events of their lives, the misfortune of their lives, and they grumble, they become anxious, they become dissatisfied, they fret, they resist. He said, this is very foolish because you have no control over it. The wise man, he said, controls himself. He controls his emotions. He recognizes that this is everything that has happened to him is part of natural law, God ordained. And he doesn't fight it. He accepts his fate. And so this is related to that larger phenomenon that we talked about of interest in psychological states, because the Stoic was always examining his state of mind and thinking about how he might be reacting to something when he shouldn't be. And so Stoicism became very popular. I should mention that the word Stoic today, some of you are probably familiar with it, means that you're unemotional. And maybe we can see why this has become attached to this word, this idea of Stoicism. Now, I should mention that Zeno conceived of the entire world, the entire universe, as one big polis. So he's kind of using that theme in his mind, that the world is one big polis. God is kind of like a king over that polis. His laws are like the laws of this polis. He's a lawgiver. And Zeno believed that each of us had a spark of the divine in us. So we had a little piece of this God in us. And so we were all really brothers and sisters, living in this giant polis, this world polis. And so a term associated with the Stoics is this idea of cosmopolitan. Let me make sure I spell it right. Cosmopolitanism. As I said, it's tough not to be able to spell. It's my cross I have to bear. Cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism became associated with this. And this is two Greek words. Polis, you will recognize here the polis part of it. And ism is polis is city, citizen. Ism is a belief, and cosmos is the word for world. So really, in Zeno's philosophy, we were all citizens of the world, which was an attractive idea in the Hellenistic age, in the wake of Alexander's conquest, as barriers were broken down. Okay. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the arts now, and particularly about literature. Poetry made a comeback in the Hellenistic age, but it wasn't the poetry of an earlier age, the epic, which we associate with Homer and the Dark Age and maybe the Archaic Age, with heroism and heroes and the like. That did not resonate with people who weren't feeling particularly heroic at the moment. And these were defeated people. Rather, what became popular were nature poems. And these nature poems are sometimes called idyls. Idyls, excuse me. And let me write that down. An idyl is spelled A-D-I-D-Y-L-L. An idyl. An idyl. Looks like it's idyll, but it's pronounced idle. And these are pastoral poems, poems about nature and pasture land, sheep. And so these poems will take the reader to a nice, quiet, relaxing place, usually set somewhere in the countryside. And this is a type of escapist sort of literature that became very popular. Another type of literature, and this was a new type of literature that was popular in the Hellenistic age, was the Hellenistic romance novel. Yeah, novels were invented in Hellenistic times. And oftentimes, these novels have pretty common themes. They're usually two lovers who fate somehow rips apart. Kind of a common one is they're kidnapped by pirates, and they spend the rest of the novel trying to get back together, and one is sold into slavery and the other one goes through some misfortune. And the novel is really a vehicle that we can explore their psychological states through. All right, so these are very psychological in nature. The visual arts also go through some important developments in the Hellenistic age. What I have in front of you here is a statue of the classical age. And the classical age, statues were really fascinated with the ideal male. All right. Usually statues are portrayed as masculine, self-confident. These were themes that dominated the classical age. Well, conquest and defeat in Greece changed a lot of that. Entered in a new period of vulnerability. People were subjects. Their polis was not the same. They're insecure. And so new themes and new interests begin to predominate. People still do male statues, but there's now a interest in the ideal female. This is the Venus de Milo, or the Aphrodite of Milos, if you want to use its Greek name. And so sculptors begin to appreciate and begin to portray female beauty. And so there's a broadening of interest. You won't find female nudes in the classical age, but you will in the Hellenistic age. But there's also an interest not in just the ideal, but also or the perfect or the wealthy, but there's a deal in an interest in exploring different classes of people. This is an impoverished old woman, and so sculptors will portray even people of lower classes. They will portray the disabled, or even of other races. And so there's a big broadening of the interests of the Hellenistic artist. It's not just the ideal male anymore. And all of these people are portrayed as individuals and unique instead of um, some idealized form. And so individuality, as I said, is a big theme, and we see this in the arts. Now, part of this was related to new sources of patronage. So let me write this word down. It's kind of an important word, patronage. Patronage, patronage. And patronage is basically the financing of the arts. In classical times, the great patron of the arts was the city-state itself. We can think of classical Athens, pictured here, for instance. A significant part of the budget of the city-state was toward its own beautification, its own enhancement of its prestige, its glorification of its city, its people. And so it was the community that financed the arts, primarily in the classical age. But in the Hellenistic age, as society became more stratified, as wealth became concentrated, we start to see the rise of wealthy aristocrats as patrons of the arts, and also especially kings. And there's the old saying, he who pays the piper calls the tune. In other words, if you're paying for the art, you get to determine what its contents will be. And so we see a move away from the community and more toward the individual in terms of its payment. Now, oftentimes, kings were interested in using, so this is a community sort of art of the classical age, but in the Hellenistic period, we see kings using it as a form of propaganda, art to enhance their image as a powerful ruler or as a divine ruler, a way to show off their power, either by pictures of themselves or the art that they will buy for their subjects to show off how great they are. We see a lot more private art bought by private people, as I mentioned, and this is evident in the rise of portraiture. The portrait becomes a very popular genre of art in the Hellenistic era. There are some in the classical era, but not really like we see in the Hellenistic era. And unlike their earlier predecessors, when we talk about the Hellenistic portrait, we're talking about a portrait where the artist is really trying to capture the inner nature of his subject. What's going through his mind? What is his character like? And so it's pretty tough to do, I would imagine. I mean, I'm not a good artist, so just drawing anything that looks like a person would be hard for me, or to sculpt something that looks like a person. Never mind trying to capture what's going through their mind and doing this all in stone. So it's really a high level of artistry if you think about it, but it goes back to this fascination with what's going through people's minds, inner nature. Another theme that differentiates classical and Hellenistic art is the rise of theatricality. And I'll talk about what that means in a second. But this here is a piece of work from the classical age, very typical. It's got clean lines. There's not a lot going on. It's not busy in any ways. It's an ideal sense of beauty here. She's young, she's beautiful, she's calm, she's peaceful. These are all things that the classical artist tried to convey, very clean, calm sort of a sculpture. But when we get to the Hellenistic age, well, we go for the theatrical. This is a Hellenistic statue, Laocoon. is the subject here. And it's very dramatic, as you can see. There's lots of movement. Look at his facial expressions. He's not calm at all. He's in agony. And so the artist is trying to convey this. This is part of Hellenistic artists' fascination with inner states. The Hellenistic artist tries to convey pathos. Some of you guys might know this word, pathos. P-A-T-H-O-S, pathos. And pathos is a quality that that arouses a feeling of pity or sorrow, usually. And so the artist is trying to make his work evocative. He's trying to get us, the audience, to feel a sense of sorrow or sadness or fear or whatever the statue happens to be feeling. Again, this is part of this psychological sort of orientation we find in the Hellenistic age. Exploration of emotions. Explorations of emotions under duress or pain or fear or anguish, okay? And so we see a lot of this in the Hellenistic era. Okay, so that concludes the second part of this lecture. What I would like you to do is to take some notes, write these down, and especially this idea of vulnerability and inwardness and individuality. How are these evident in the philosophy and in the arts of the Hellenistic age?